Thank you all. This is the last panel of the day, and we've left plenty of time for this one because it sort of brings the day's discussions together. And the topic is, how does Australia pursue its national interest in a might is right world? Can we save the multilateral furniture? Can we work with other countries to mitigate the economic damage from Trump's tariff war? Is the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a model for the future? So the speakers, I'll introduce them one at a time. First speaker is the Professor, the Honourable Gareth Evans, and then an alphabet soup of distinguished awards. He was obviously, as you all know, it's a legend, Cabinet Minister through the Hawke-Keating government's Foreign Minister, and until recently, a few years ago, the ANU Chancellor. Gareth.
Well, thanks very much, Michael, and congratulations on bringing us together. If some of the forces of darkness in the media have been vulgar enough to describe this as a Turnbull vanity project, may I just say, may there be many more such projects, because this is a very important conversation that you've convened, and thank you for it. Well, pursuing national interests in a might is right world. Less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and more global engagement. Since the first Trump administration, I've been saying over and over again that these are the four principles which should guide us in protecting and advancing Australia's national interests in the world that we're now facing. And with Trump now back in the White House, more ill-informed, more prejudiced, more self-absorbed, more dangerous than ever, and putting a cooperative rather than a might-based international multilateral system more at risk than ever, I really believe it's time to absolutely double down on those particular principles. And I'll have something to say about each of them in turn. In doing so, I'm rather conscious that a fair bit of what I'll be saying has been said before, but I'll be saying it for the first time, so you'll just have to bear with me. First, a word on national interests. In any discussion of national interests, my frame of reference has been, since I was Foreign Minister, has always been, that for Australia, as for everyone else, the term should embrace not only the obvious traditional duo of national security, physical security, and economic prosperity, but also our national interest in what I call being and being seen to be a good international citizen, or putting it more simply, a decent country, one not wholly consumed by immediate self-interest, but committed as well to our common humanity and to the common good. The point is that behaving decently, and this is particularly important in making the case, as I will, for more global engagement, behaving decently generates not just warm inner glows. It does produce hard-headed national interest returns of the kind which should, I believe, satisfy even the most cynical realist. Above all, the kind of reputational return that makes a country one that others admire, trust, want to visit, study in, invest in, and support in a crisis. What most of the world, if not Donald Trump, has long recognised and still understands as soft power. Well, as to the first of my principles for advancing our national interest in the current environment, it does mean recognising, as so many people have been saying all day, that the ANZUS alliance is manifestly now not what it was, if indeed it ever was. It's delivered us clearly important technical, logistic and intelligence support in the past, and hopefully will continue to do so in the future, not least through AUKUS Pillar 2, which I'm wholly supportive of. But whatever the psychological comfort that the alliance might have offered us in the days gone by, the reality is that ANZUS has never bound the United States to defend us, even in the event of existential attack. Washington will no doubt shake a deterrent fist. Washington will no doubt threaten and deliver retaliation if its own assets on Australian soil are threatened or attacked, but that's as far as our expectations should extend. All that AUKUS and its associated new alliance commitments have done for Australia's defence is paint more targets on our back. Not only Pine Gap, which has always been the case, as Dennis Richardson unkindly pointed out earlier on today, but now Perth with the Stirling submarine base, Northern Australia with the Darwin Marine Base and the B-52 base in Tyndall, and also a quite possible future submarine base on the east coast. The crazy irony is that we are spending an eye-watering amount to build new capability to meet military threats which are most likely to arise because we're building that capability and using it to assist the United States. As to more self-reliance, I'm among those who believe, Jeff Raby in particular, as he put it so well today, that the red alert China threat to our security has been wildly overstated, and that outright invasion, as distinct from, yes, grey zone operations, yes, blockade attempts, yes, hit-and-run attacks on particular facilities, outright invasion really is almost inconceivable. But, of course, I totally accept, as I think we all should, that defence planning always has to be based on worst-case assumptions, taking into account potential adversaries' capabilities, not just known or projected likely future intent. And in that context, it's hard to disagree with what so many have been saying today, that we are just going to have to get used to doing more, to spending significantly more, and prioritising that expenditure more wisely. As to what more self-reliance would look like in military terms, I think I'm pretty much on board with what Sam Roggeveen was saying in this respect, that bearing in mind that our geographical distance is our greatest asset, Beijing, it's always worth remembering, is closer to London than to Sydney, then the appropriate strategy is what Sam calls the echidna strategy. Unthreatening but very spiky, focusing on making our adjacent seas and skies unsafe to the point of hopefully impenetrability for any opposing force through a combination of air, underwater, missile, cyber detection and destruction capabilities, including many autonomous capabilities of the kind we've just been talking about. As to more Asia, that to me means three main things. First of all, strengthening regional trade and economic relationships and the capacity to push back collectively against Trump's and others' trade warfare, themes which I no doubt Shiro will be fully developing. Secondly, it means, I think, strengthening political and, where possible, military relationships with key regional neighbours like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, on both a bilateral and a minilateral basis, partly to concentrate China's mind on the reality that overreach will not be without pushback, but also to maximise collective regional diplomatic pressure on both China and the United States to reach mutually accommodating détente in the period ahead, rather than engaging in a confrontational struggle for primacy with all the risk that that obviously entails, has been said so often here today, of ending in tears and which nobody in our region actually wants. More Asia, thirdly, to me, means also for me Australia trying to develop with China itself not just a one-dimensional economic relationship, but a far more multi-dimensional one, particularly in the multilateral sphere, where by Beijing, I think it has to be acknowledged for all its distaste that it's shown for international law in the South China Sea, which I readily acknowledge and am very critical of, for all of that, in recent times, it's been playing a more interested and constructive role than has generally been recognised, and certainly a far more constructive one than we're seeing now from Trump's America. Australia should be actively exploring the scope for cooperation in a whole range of global and regional public goods issues, from climate change to nuclear arms control, from terrorism to health pandemics, from peacekeeping to responding to mass atrocity crimes, and of course defending free trade. Finally, and coming back more obviously to the multilateral theme, as to more global engagement, with Trump taking the wrecking ball that he has been to critical multilateral institutions like WHO, WTO, International Criminal Court, and increasingly the whole United Nations system itself, it's never been more important for countries who can make a difference, and Australia is one of them, to rally in their support. Our value added here is essentially middle power diplomacy, the crucial tool of which is international coalition building in support of global and regional public goods. Australia, I think, is generally acknowledged, has been at its best, and our standing in the world has been at its highest when we play to our national strengths as a capable, credible middle power working with others of similar stature, not just familiar suspects like the Nordics and Canada, but also on occasion in our own region, countries like Indonesia, as we did in the Cambodia exercise, when we work through the United Nations and other international institutions, and when we project ourselves effectively on the international stage as what I've described as a good international citizen. In an increasingly might is right world where the United States has, let's face it, abandoned all pretense of decency and a liberal authoritarianism seems to be on a roll, I continue to believe, I hope not impossibly naively, that the best course for Australia to chart is not to succumb to any temptation to follow suit, but to stand tall in support of a decent international order, to work our tail off diplomatically to find like-minded others who share that commitment and who have the energy and the stamina to stay the course until the wheel turns. As always, in the international sphere, as in life itself, I think it's important to stay optimistic. If we cease to believe in the possibility of a safer, saner and better world and the utility of working for it, we're certainly never going to inhabit one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gareth. Professor Shiro Armstrong is a Professor of Economics at ANU, Director of the Australia-Japan Research Centre, Editor of the East Asia Forum, and Director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research. Shiro.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you for the invitation to this really important conversation. I want to pick up on a few points that Gareth raised, focused mostly on the trading front. But I want to make 3 points. And the first is a multilateral trading system is critical for Australia's national security. So, in fact, it's one of the 2 pillars of Australia's national security alongside, of course, our alliance relationship. And they have been since we signed up to them in the wartime pacts with America in 1942 and since Bretton Woods. For open economies like Australia's, the system blunts economic weapons pointed at us. We saw that protection when we were hit by trade sanctions from China. Those trade sanctions were not effective, except for a little bit of a cost initially, and then mainly in wine, but our exporters were able to find other markets because the global system was open. And that is not the case. That was not the case in the 1930s, of course, but an open global trading system has alternative suppliers and alternative buyers. Of course, what's necessary for that to work is to have a flexible market. And this is where Heather's points this morning are really important, to have a macroeconomic framework that targets full employment and, of course, flexible markets. And it's worth remembering that the WTO, for all its problems, and it's on life support, provided the exit ramp from that episode of trade coercion for Australia and China. I think the economic security we get from open global markets, and I'll come back to our partners in a second, it has to be recognised is now under threat from the Trump onslaught against this system. The real risk isn't, and I'll explain this further, just the initial tariffs from Trump against, well, reciprocal tariffs that we might see in a couple of days' time, or against steel and aluminium imports. It's really the risk of contagion from US tariffs. Countries do like to emulate, and then the flood of goods from China, for example, into other markets means other countries are going to be putting up tariffs against Chinese goods, and these are contagious. I think going back, just remembering and reminding ourselves how important this multilateral trading system is for East Asia, not just for delivering development and prosperity, but also for security. We just have to look at the Japan-China relationship that's held together with economic interdependence, but this is true for Southeast Asia as well. And the whole European project is based on this idea of economic interdependence being a source of peace. It's now this system that Washington is putting pressure on, and that's a top priority for Australia to defend this system. I think it's worth reminding, this is my second point, the United States looks like it's going to be protectionist for the foreseeable future and out of the game, if not a main source of uncertainty in international trade for the foreseeable future. I think on this, Trump is a symptom, not a cause. We only need to look at the Biden administration for US protectionist measures. And this is because it relates to deep domestic problems in the United States of inequality and communities being left behind. Again, another reminder for us about the importance of our social safety net and economic reforms and not having increasing inequality. The United States now comprises only 11% of global trade, and that is going to shrink as these tariffs come on. We know it's 11% because that's what the United States is supposed to pay the WTO to help run the WTO administration processes, and it's refusing to pay. The United States is trying to bring back manufacturing. If it succeeds, it will be a much poorer country as a result. It became rich from globalization and economic engagement with China. The problem, though, was maldistribution of the gains from that trade. Of course, another target, we're told, is to reduce the trade deficit in the United States. Well, we know from first year macroeconomics that that trade deficit is a result of the domestic savings and investment imbalance in the United States. So they can reduce that trade deficit if they stop attracting foreign investment and they stop being the global reserve currency. I think we're going to see, for the foreseeable future, 1, 2, 3 US presidencies, the United States continuing to be a source of uncertainty. Now, I think we've heard about the 1930s a few times already today, and you can see parallels with markets closing up and tariffs rising. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 by the United States were not particularly high by 19th century US standards. What made them different and what made them hurt and deepen the Great Depression and prolong the Great Depression was all the retaliation. And we're at risk of retaliation and a retaliatory spiral now. Canada and Europe have retaliated against US tariffs, and they do so for leverage, and they target the retaliation, but that is high risk and welfare reducing. If we really need to retaliate, if countries need to do so politically, there are other things to do that are not welfare reducing, such as review and weaken intellectual property protections in trade agreements with the United States. Countries had to sign up to these stronger IP protections that are just wealth transfers to the United States in exchange for market access to the US, and that is now being revoked. But and that's in our interest to do so, but more than that, I would argue for collective action, not against the United States, but to preserve the multilateral trading system. So with that, my third and last point, what to do is to recognise we're not alone in this. In fact, it's really most of the world, if not the whole world, minus the United States, and our biggest stake is in East Asia. The economic and political consequences of trade unravelling, interdependence unravelling in our region are significant. The impact on the Southeast Asian economy, Productivity Commission's done some modelling in the first Trump administration, but the IMF, World Bank and others have estimated between 9 and 12% hit to GDP in Southeast Asia if we lose confidence in the global trading system and countries start to see contagion of tariffs. That means political instability in Southeast Asia. And this is the region that's most integrated into the global economy, and they have the most to lose. So this is where we have leverage, and this is where we have influence and agency that we need to work on and need to focus our efforts. And we can do so through the ASEAN Plus processes. These are arrangements, trade agreements, but beyond trade agreements that involve deep economic cooperation processes, including through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Arrangement. So these ASEAN Plus processes, of course, include us, but they include Japan, South Korea, and China. And it helps make a common cause with Europe and others. But this is our base to mobilise. So mobilising collective action on the trade front is going to be difficult enough, but perhaps we need to focus a bit more on the energy transition. The energy transition imperative and avoiding catastrophic climate risks is where I think we can help mobilise action in the region and globally. That requires open markets to investment in green production, to green goods, and even with the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, that's where the rest of the world has an interest in moving forward and protecting global public goods. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Shiro. Next speaker is Dr. Alan Dupont, who's on my right, a graduate of the Royal Military College and the US Foreign Service Institute, and has worked, as many of you know, or all of you know, I guess, extensively at the interface of security, politics, business and technology. Alan.
Thanks, Malcolm, and good afternoon, everybody. I might start by making a few framing comments about what Donald Trump means for the US alliance, and then I'll move in to give you my views about what I think we should do about it. So I believe that the Trump ascendancy presages a radical change in Washington's approach to the US alliance. Mutual trust, shared interests and values have little or diminished weight. Trump, the deal maker, doesn't distinguish between friends and foes. This means the major beneficiaries of his second coming are more likely to be autocratic challengers who have no love for America at the expense of traditional friends and allies who are being treated with disdain. The US president has made it crystal clear that he wants supplicants, resources and real estate to make America great again. Unfortunately, on the evidence so far, MAGA looks like being at everybody else's expense. We need to inoculate ourselves against Trump's destructive and anti-democratic impulses by hedging against the real possibility that the US alliance will lose its deterrence value and its utility as a defence and foreign policy multiplier for Australia. That's my plan B. The issue is, can we trust an America first America, as the Australian's Cameron Stewart asked in a recent column? Now, Gareth may be surprised to know that I'm on a unity ticket with him in believing that an efficacious plan B means less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and a dash of what I might call global engagement, although we shouldn't neglect Europe or our Kiwi friends across the ditch, as they would say. I'm not advocating, like Gareth, that we sever the alliance, but it would be prudent to rethink what a more limited and transactional alliance can deliver. And it's time to do more for ourselves. Like Europeans, we have freeloaded on the US for too long to the detriment of our own defence and national security capabilities. Now, you won't be surprised, Gareth, there's a few other points that I don't quite agree with you on, so I just want to put them out there. Look, ruling out measures to improve our security because they paint more targets on our back only encourages adversaries to weaken our defence by trading on our fear of attack. As I've argued elsewhere, the "we are a big target" argument flies in the face of strategic logic and alliance practice. Yes, we are a target, but that is the price we pay for our independence and sovereignty, as does any self-respecting country. Are China or the US going to change their policies because they fear being targeted? Is this a new national security praxis that should determine our strategy? If so, then we should prepare for an avalanche of threats from adversaries who think we will buckle at the first sign of pressure. Echidna strategies that are spiky but unthreatening are, in my view, manifestly inadequate for the threatening world we now confront. I much prefer a venomous sea wasp strategy because we live in a maritime neighbourhood. Touch a sea wasp, if you don't know what one is, it's a pretty nasty jellyfish, boxfish, right? Touch one of these and see what happens. You may very well die. So, while Xi Jinping remains China's COE, chairman of everything, it's difficult to see how Beijing can be a genuine security partner for Australia simply because a China-first China poses more of a challenge to our sovereignty than MAGA America. That's not to say we shouldn't trade with China or attempt to improve bilateral ties. But let's understand the limits of rapprochement. We shouldn't delude ourselves that Xi is invested in the success of the democracy project. I'm all for multilateralism, and being a good global citizen. But the multilateral institutions and norms established by the West as the foundational pillars of Pax Americana are demonstrably crumbling. It's not a question of saving the multilateral furniture, but rather renovating it for the times. Key international institutions are either dysfunctional, struggling for relevance, or have been co-opted by the powerful for their own national interests. We need to put more effort into alternative or complementary approaches to traditional multilateralism. This means smaller, more flexible and focused minilaterals, plurilaterals, coalitions of the willing, and meaningful strategic partnerships that measurably contribute to our hard and soft power. We should emulate the Philippines by intensifying middle power cooperation with fellow Asian and European democracies to check Trump's excesses and resist the hegemonic ambitions of revisionist states, as Richard Heydarian argues. Let me make 4 suggestions of my own in answer to the question of what we should do to protect our sovereignty and astutely navigate a might is right world. First, Australia is more dependent on free trade than most nations, but we can't remain open if everyone else is erecting trade barriers. With globalisation waning and the WTO losing its relevance and capacity to settle disputes, accelerated trade diversification is a no-brainer. It's a dangerous and potentially fatal dependence to rely upon one country for 30% of our export income, particularly one that shares few of our interests or values, is rapidly decoupling from the West and moving from mercantilism to a form of autarky. Second, with protectionism on the rise and global supply chains increasingly disrupted by geopolitics, we should take a leaf from the playbooks of China and the US and increase support for priority sovereign capabilities in advanced manufacturing, defence industry, cutting-edge technology and critical minerals processing. Third, Australia desperately needs a world-class defence industry capable of exporting to the world. We are already competitive in many areas of design, innovation, advanced manufacturing and R&D, but pockets of excellence and niche capabilities aren't enough. We still import most of our major defence equipment. Australian companies, unfortunately, are bit players in a defence industry universe dominated by big, largely American prime contractors. And we have no defence industry strategic plan or a funding model that meets our needs and provides a pathway to greater defence self-reliance. The answer is to scale up and join up, like Israel, Sweden, and more recently South Korea. That's not to exclude the United States, by the way. Growing a competitive defence industry must be a national priority, but it can't be left to defence, which doesn't have the expertise or authority to implement the necessary changes. Prime ministerial leadership is essential. Finally, these trade, defence, industry, technology and foreign policy initiatives must be integrated into a national security strategy fit for today's turbulent times. It's a bipartisan failing that despite widespread calls for such a strategy, the first and only one ever produced in this country was by the Gillard government in 2013. What a different world that was. Let me quote from Gillard's foreword to that strategy. She said, "Our strategic outlook is largely positive. We live in one of the safest and most cohesive nations in the world. We have a strong economy. A major war is unlikely. Our alliance with the United States is as strong as ever." I venture that it would be a much different foreword today. To conclude, in addition to Gareth's 4 main points, which I support, albeit with my qualifications, we need greater trade diversification, less China, more sovereign capabilities, a world-class defence industry, and an overarching national security strategy to bind them. Thank you.
Very good. Alan, thank you so much. John McCarthy, former ambassador to Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, the United States of America, has that in common with Dennis, Indonesia, Japan, and High Commissioner to India, currently a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. Following on from everything that's been said on this panel, I don't think I'll attempt to give you a narrative, but just a few points which have occurred to me in the lead up to this discussion and during it. The first point is this, and I think most in this room would understand it, but I'm not sure that the population as a whole in Australia yet understands it. And that's that we really have to revise our thinking about the United States as a country. It's simply not the same polity that it was in the 90s or indeed before 9/11, which I think is a convenient date to see a real change. There have been an enormous number of shifts in American thinking, not only on the question of its economy, the class issues in the United States, but the whole issue of how the United States relates to the rest of the world. I think all that has changed in the United States, and it's not just Trump, and we have to understand that. The second thing I think we still have to understand, particularly also in this room, is that aspects of Trumpism will pass. He's a president who's got some very particular views. He's in a very strong position now, having had a good election result. Control of House and Senate by the Republicans, a majority of Republicans in the Supreme Court, all that you know. So he's in a strong position now. But America historically changes. And you can't rule out some reversion in American policies to the sort of thinking that we were used to towards the end of the last century. Okay, well, what have we got now in terms of the way the United States relates to the rest of the world? And that, of course, includes Australia here. First of all, on the economic side, it's protectionism at best, and it's international rent-seeking at worst. It's really an appalling regime. Let's just understand that. Second, there's a drive to protect real and imagined interests in the Western Hemisphere. And this is all the Greenland stuff and the Canada stuff, which is, to us, absolutely weird. But there is, of course, a historical background to American strategic interest, particularly in Canada, obviously Alaska going back to the last century, and indeed Greenland. Also, of course, very significant sense in the United States that the rest of the Americas belongs to the United States, and a very, very proprietorial outlook towards the United States, towards Latin America, particularly Mexico and Central America. But that's a shift, and it reflects where the focus of this administration is going to be to a very considerable degree. Let's not be put off by the weirdness of it. This is real stuff going on in the United States. What the overall effect will be over the longer term is still an open question, but it's real. The third is almost a reversal of America's Atlantic policy. And this, again, is extraordinary if you look at the way the United States has related to Europe with all the ups and downs since the Second World War. There's a policy on Gaza which is at odds not only with most of the rest of the world, but including, of course, here, Western Europe, Canada, and Australia. Now, on Asia, there's still uncertainty. The Asia policy of the United States is still very much a work in progress, if you could call it that. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the way it's going to go, and as has already been well rehearsed this morning, this really relates to American policy towards China and all the implications of that. Now, there are sort of two broad sets of dangers for us in this. And there are two extremes, or possible extremes, of United States policy. The first is that Trump might look to have a sort of Asian Yalta, which gives China a sphere of influence in Asia, which would include, presumably, China being able to incorporate Taiwan in some way, and an understanding that the United States will move back from the region. Well, that would, of course, have enormous implications for Korea and Japan, and as I'll come to in a moment, that also, of course, has very considerable implications for us. The other extreme, if you like, is that the United States, in an active, somewhat aggressive mood, could take steps which would cause a Chinese reaction, which would also not be in our interests. And two possibilities here are a definite and pronounced abandonment of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan, or indeed, as has been mooted occasionally in Republican circles in the United States, an abandonment of one China policy. Now that could well prompt a very severe reaction from China, which would have implications for the rest of the region. Look, in all this, I think China, may be encouraged to be active for a couple of reasons. One, it's seen what the United States has done on Ukraine and NATO. And they may think in Beijing, well, if you're seeing this sort of approach taken by Trump's Washington, what are the implications for us and what are the implications for Taiwan? The other factor is that the Chinese have always seen the Americans as having a strategic advantage over them because of the American alliance network, a network which, of course, they don't have. Now, they must be able to take some succor from the fact that in present circumstances, the Trump administration seems to be doing its best to wreak havoc with alliances. We don't know yet what's going to happen in Asia, but certainly in the rest of the world. Now, how do we handle this? Look, I come back here to Gareth in some of his sterling work as Foreign Minister, really looked at Australian interests in three broad areas. One is the security relationship primarily with the United States. The second is our interests in the region. And the third is our interests in the whole multilateral framework in the world. Now, part of that, the work that we put into that multilateral framework, in turn was linked to the theory of good international citizenship. And I'll come back to that. Looking at these three areas and how we face up to them in present circumstances, I'd like to make the following comments. First of all, on the alliance. Now, if China is indeed a military threat, and I'm of that group that sees it as a potential military threat, but not to the extent, I think, of many in what you might now call the security establishment in Australia. I see the potential, certainly, for China to be a threat to Australia, but it's not something that needs to dominate the agenda at all times, and there have been periods in the last 5 or 6 years where it has seemed to do that. Indeed, I would argue that on many occasions we led with the chin in our policy towards China. It's not, we undertook policies which I think were asking for difficulty. But nonetheless, if you accept that it is a potential threat, and I think you have to accept that it is a potential threat to Australia, we then have to look at what is the counter to that. And despite what I've heard about Sam Roggeveen's thesis on the Echidna strategy, despite what I hear about minilateral relationships, including military relationships with countries in Southeast Asia, I can't see a deterrent to a Chinese threat which is of the same dimension or the same probable effect as the maintenance of American military power in the region. So for that reason alone, the alliance, I think, remains a central aspect, or should remain a central aspect of our policy. Now, the question then arises in turn, and this was touched on by one of the panels this morning. Are we looking for an equilibrium in the region between the United States and China? Or are we faced with the prospect of either a disequilibrium in the region, which means that the Americans seek to maintain primacy at all costs in the region, or they go? Now, there was a view put forward this morning, I think, that really you're only looking at those last two options. That is to say, maintenance of American primacy in the region at all costs, or they go. I think I come down with the fact that you can actually have an equilibrium. It might be very uncomfortable, but I would claim, I think, that over the last 6 or 7 years, we have had a sort of equilibrium in the region. It hasn't been very nice. In fact, it's been very aggressive on both parts some of the time, but it's sort of worked. And I would see it as in the Australian interest to work very much to maintain that equilibrium. And if there is any possibility of a drawdown in mutual hostility between the United States and China, and we can play a part in that, that should be central to our policy. Okay. The second point is, and I think, again, we need to understand this better in Australia than we currently do. American strategic policy towards Asia, what we now call the Indo-Pacific, has traditionally been focused on Northeast Asia. It has not been focused on Southeast Asia. It has not been focused on Australia. You look at all the experts, all the officials who've been in successive administrations in Washington on Asia. They're nearly all experts on either China or Japan. That's their interest. The American focus militarily is on Northeast Asia. In the Cold War period, the junction between Russia, China, the Koreas, Japan, and the United States. And that continues to be the case. If the Americans lose interest in that part of the world, in Northeast Asia, you will automatically see, in my view, a follow-on in terms of loss of interest in Southeast Asia. That is their focus. During Vietnam, of course, which was an exception to this, you have to bear in mind that although there was major American political energy going into, of course, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, it was as a result of their perceptions of a communist threat coming from Russia and China. It wasn't because of what was happening in those countries themselves. Okay. Now, our own region, what should we do here? Look, it's basically a question, I think, of more political energy doing more of what we're already doing. Military relationships, good. The economic relationships with Southeast Asia, all good, all positive. I don't think, by the way, it would do us any harm to try and diminish the perception in Southeast Asia that when Australia is talking about security issues, it is basically echoing the voice of Washington. I assure you, I spent a lot of my life in Asia, and that has been a constant refrain. I'll give you one example. A few years ago, I was back in Delhi. I was talking to a former national security advisor, and we reflected on the time in the early, about 2002, when Australia began to put real energy again into the relationship with India. And the question that came back, and this is a man who knows the world very well, was, did you do that at the request of the United States? And of course the answer was no, we did it for our own very good interests. But that is just one reflection of many, many conversations, certainly I've had in Southeast Asia. This is not to do with Australian policy necessarily as a whole, but it is a view about our security policy in Southeast Asia. Certainly since 9/11, we have been seen as basically echoing United States policies, not as having policies of our own. Look, the final point, and this is again coming down to Gareth's point, and this is what we do about international machinery. Look, I think international machinery, being a good global citizen, that bundle of issues, I think international machinery is in very bad shape right now, and that's largely because of the policies of the United States, particularly Trump. not just Trump, but particularly Trump. Now, what we do about that now, I think the old machinery, some of it's intact, a lot of it's gone for good. If there is going to be an effort to put back in shape some form of international machinery which will work, it has got to take into account the interests of China. You can't do it without that. And it has to take into account, to a greater extent, the interests of what is now called, somewhat erroneously, I think, the Global South. The Global South, the developing world, now has countries which are moving well out of the development phase, and in the next 10 or 15 years will become powerful economies in their own right. And that includes particularly Indonesia, close to us. India is already there. Brazil is another example. Some of them are BRICS, others aren't. But let's bear in mind that it's worth the effort. I mean, if we've managed to cope very, very well from the 40s onwards with international machinery. It's helped our foreign policy. We've worked through international machinery. We need to try and keep it in some sort of good order. Final point on the region, coming back to the region, is, look, when we talk to the region, and I come back to this factor, we're seen on security issues as very much reflecting American policy. We're also seen in the conversations I've had now for many years as being a frightened country, a country which is obsessed with the Chinese threat. Now, we think that the countries in Southeast Asia, aren't perhaps standing up for their interests sufficiently, but they have a different perspective. Their perspective is they want to stay in the middle. They don't want to take sides. And that's why you've got now a country like Indonesia applying both for the OECD and also for the BRICS. Same sort of thing as Thailand, a slightly different process. But this sort of thinking is all over Southeast Asia. So they don't want to be told, what to do and how to stand up to China. What they need to be told and what they need to be helped to do is essentially demonstrate their own resilience on their own terms, both towards the United States and China. So if we have one message that we want to try and convey, and we want to try and convey it in reasonably nuanced terms, is that what we want to see in Southeast Asia are countries who are making up their minds in their own terms about what their own futures will be. And if they do that right, that will suit our particular interests.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. That's great. Thank you. Well, 4 great presentations, please. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, yeah. Oh, George. Yes, please. Yes.
Susanna Patton from the Lowy Institute. I wanted to pick up on the question around more Asia and what that might look like. I think it's actually a pretty remarkable story over the last few years that Australia's relationships with many countries in Southeast Asia are actually arguably better than they ever have been. And I think if you told a lot of people even 10 years ago that we would be, for example, doing amphibious exercises with Indonesia, deploying tanks, F-35s to Indonesia, that we would sign a defence cooperation agreement that is essentially a kind of status of forces agreement, they would have been surprised that we would do maritime trilateral activities involving Australia, India, Indonesia, or even that the Vietnamese People's Navy sent a vessel to Australia last year, which was the first time they deployed to a Western country. So there is actually a pretty remarkable story, but the obvious limitation is that we don't share a common threat perception. And I think pretty clear from what John said, they're not going to come over to our way of seeing things. So my question is, to what extent do you think Australia should consider making adjustments in our own strategic policy settings to actually drive greater strategic convergence with Southeast Asia?
Susanna, can I reframe that? Because our colleagues here have spoken at length. Why don't you answer your own question? What do you think? Yeah, tell us what you think.
I think that would be very difficult for us to do because I don't think that were going to move to their way of seeing the region. I guess based on the discussion here today as well, I didn't see anyone arguing that we should move to a position of accommodating China that sort of represents anything like the accommodations that many Southeast Asian countries have already made. And so to me, that means there will be a cap or a ceiling on what we can do with them, and that in many ways, the idea of doing more with Asia is actually a little bit spurious, potentially.
Okay. Well, Greg Barton lives in Jakarta. Greg, gives your view on the Bapak Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Malcolm. Actually, Bandung, Indonesia, not Jakarta, because Deakin Lancaster, Indonesia, has a new joint venture, new international branch campus in Bandung. Thank you for organising today. I think this is really substantial and really helpful, not least when it comes to thinking about how we engage with Asia. It's interesting, very telling that we're this far into, well, it's now a real election campaign, but it's been a quasi-campaign for some time, and we haven't really discussed the issues we're discussing here today. We do live in interesting times, and all the problems of that apocryphal proverb. But these are also times of opportunity if we take them. If we don't take them, then we'll be much the worse for it. And I think a big opportunity is to engage with the rest of the world, but particularly with Asia, particularly with Southeast Asia, and particularly with Indonesia. There has been this sort of barrier or sort of unquantified apprehension about the extent to which we simply align with America and become the deputy sheriff, fallback. I think history will find that the end of Pax Americana didn't begin with Trump 47, but it certainly removed the ambiguity and finished it off in a nasty and ugly fashion. And that means that whilst we're not backing away from ANZUS and from AUKUS, we're much more decoupled from simply automatically being seen as a satellite in America's sphere. And if and when, and it seems more likely a case of when than if, Beijing moves across the Taiwan Straits, we won't be compelled to respond because America won't respond. And in some ways that'll be a blessing because much as it's a grim reality to think about, we with the rest of our region and our neighbour Indonesia will be sitting there hoping for the best and fearful of what's happening but not actively participating, and then the test will come with how we respond after that. So I think the suggestion that we're framing ourselves in terms of our alliance with America and our antipathy or demonising of China, I think that a lot of that's been resolved or is beginning to be resolved. But it's up to us to seize the opportunity to engage more with Indonesia. If you think of yourself as an Indonesian, parents sending your kids off to university, the prospects now of sending your kids to America, which is something a lot of families would love to have done in years past, and people proudly have their alumni stickers on the back window of their cars, fills people now with fear. You see what ICE is doing, snatching kids off the street. America, sadly, is destroying its soft power. We hope that China steps into some of the gap left by USAID. That would be good for everyone, and we should see it as a positive thing, but we need to step into some of the soft power space and be much more serious about our engagement with the region, and particularly with Indonesia. So the Defence Cooperation Agreement signed last year with Indonesia, that was a big shift forward, but as Sam suggests, we could go even further. We could talk about Defence Alliance. We can't do that straight away, but we should start to be moving towards that becomes a natural conversation.
I think Shiro wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, look, just on engaging Indonesia and Asia more, Indonesia has applied, as John said, to join OECD and BRICS Plus, but it's also applied to join CPTPP, and we didn't mention that in the presentations. So is China and Taiwan, and this should be seen as an opportunity, right? A few other important economies have applied to join too. And CPTPP is a potential platform for renovating the rules and holding the line on protectionism, but it's got an accession problem because the only country that's being considered for accession right now is Costa Rica, not Indonesia.
UK.
The UK has acceded, yes.
Right.
But after that, there's a long queue of countries, countries, and only Costa Rica is being considered. So for an arrangement that is pushing for doubling down on rules and the rules-based order, the accession process is completely discretion-based, not rules-based. And I think there's a bit of a problem there. Now, we've got leverage. Every member has a veto on new members. So we have the ability to stop countries joining. But we need to have a process that opens up for China, Taiwan, Indonesia to know what's required to join so they can actually undertake reforms to get to the starting line. We don't have to let them in until they've undertaken reforms and commitments. Right?
Okay,
At least
now,
have a process.
Thanks, Shiro. Now, before I go to Hayley, can I just as a sort of historical footnote on TPP, when Trump was elected, he had promised to pull out of the TPP in the campaign, and there was a hope that he wouldn't go through with that. But he did. He absolutely did. And there was a general view that the TPP was stone dead. And that was shared by Shinzo Abe. And interestingly, it was actually at a dinner at our house in Sydney in January 2017 with Shinzo and Akie that we persuaded Shinzo that he should not, he was worried he would offend Trump, to be honest with you. He was worried he'd offend Trump. And I said, look, it's out of the room, out of the deal. You know, we should just go ahead. They cannot complain about this. And if they do, we just have to resist it. And they didn't complain. Anyway, once Japan got over the line, I mean, Japan was by far the biggest remaining economy in the TPP, and that's what kept it going. And we had a little frisson with the Canadians, as everyone's familiar with, but we got the deal was done. But it was very interesting to me how many of the people in the countries in the TPP had to really almost rewire their brains to think about this deal happening without American leadership. And you know, so that was, I thought it was a very good example, you know, effective Australian diplomacy, but also something that, as you say, Shiro, we will need to build on because, you know, the protectionism, tariff is the most beautiful word in the world, after all. Now, please.
I'm Sarah Percy from the University of Queensland, and I'm Canadian, which will become relevant when I ask my question.
So which threat are you pointing
Well,
to?
I wonder what I would be wanting to talk about. And actually, I want us to zero in a little bit more about the impact of Trump himself and what impact that has on Australia as well on the rest of the world. We've kind of danced around this question a little bit. And I think it's really important to note a couple of things. The first is that Trump does, in fact, represent a very sharp break. It is not just a matter of gradual withdrawal from Asia. It's not traditional US isolationism. And we see this in his support for Putin, his blaming of Ukraine on being invaded on Ukraine, and his current actions in both Canada and Greenland. Now, also just to push back a little bit against John, there is one of the great interesting puzzles of international politics is the fact that Canada was never part of American strategic gains or ideas after the War of 1812, and this world's longest undefended border has been remarkably peaceful since that time. So it's not actually an long-standing American strategic goal to invade Canada at all. In fact, it's the opposite. So I think the question is, what do we do, given that we know that for the first time, not only has Australia had this long alliance with the US, but for the first time, our ally is someone who seems to think annexing and invading other countries is acceptable. And that is a sharp change from anything else we've dealt with. And I think, as was mentioned this morning in relation to AUKUS, has the potential to put Australia in a remarkably difficult position. Because what do we do in Australia if Trump comes good on some of these things that he's talking about? And by the way, it's being reported this morning that Trump is now talking about methods and tools for a third term. So we may indeed be dealing with a third Trump presidency. So what do we do? And my question for the panel is, how do we, as Gareth says, commit to multilateralism, commit to being good citizens in the face of highly enmeshed treaty and security arrangements that make it very difficult for us, as much as we would like to move out of a relationship with the US? What do you do if Trump makes good on either Greenland or Canada? We're shackled to the US in many ways in Australia. How are we going to square that circle? And what impact is that going to have on Australian security?
Well, you know, there's a sort of cloak and dagger Australian force that has already occupied Whistler. So, armed only with skis. Yes, right, please.
Look, just quickly on Canada, I never suggested that America had previously envisaged invading Canada. I think it's mind-boggling, I think, for people who think about this in Australia. That should even be a thought now. What I suggested was that a central part of American strategic thinking historically was thinking about American security in terms of the Western Hemisphere. And that included Canada, even though Canada wasn't causing any problems. There are plenty of people in South America who caused it problems from time to time, and in the Caribbean. But if you thought that was what I said, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean that, certainly. Look, on the Western Hemisphere, I'd just make the point is the Americans actually have invaded other small countries. Grenada was one case in point, and they got pretty close to it in Nicaragua in the 30s. And there is some historical background, of course. Those who thought about Iraq would see that as an invasion. That's not necessarily the main view in Australia, but certainly that view is and Vietnam is another case. So the Americans have been pretty good at invading. What they're not good at is invading friendly countries, totally friendly countries. And that's something that I think is mind-boggling. Now, if it got, this is just my view, I listened very carefully to what Dennis said this morning. I think we would have real problems if they put troops into Greenland because of the NATO factor and the sheer bullying aspect of going into a country with 58,000 Inuits with the 82nd Airborne. It's just crazy. Anyway, so I think the reaction in Australia would be quite severe. Now, Canada, everything I read about Canada is the suggestion of military action against Canada is just too crazy, but certainly economic coercion on a very large scale, I think that's important. And I think the reaction, and the politicians here would have a better view than me, but the reaction amongst the Australian public would be, I think, quite severe on that.
Thank you. I'll come back to the panel for a last word, but perhaps get some more comments from the floor, please.
Thank you. Yun Zhang, I'm affiliated with UTS Acri. I have a quite related question, actually. So for the last decade or so, we've been told that we need to be allied with the US and we support the US alliance because of democracy, because of shared values. But now we're seeing the US domestic situation, with the deporting of immigrants without due process, the installing of political commissars in higher education system, and as well as, I think you can definitely call it foreign interference into Australian universities. So I would like to know, we've been talking, it quite surprises me that we wait so long to talk about values until now, but we've been talking about how we defend ourselves. Is there a possibility that we might end up defending ourselves against the US? I know that in the economic sphere, we are, Shiro has been talking about how to do that, but for example, in foreign interference, in other spheres, is that a possibility?
Well, if they start invading allies in alphabetical order, we'll obviously be first. But I'd assume they'd gobble up Canada before us, don't you think? Is that the Gareth?
Well, if US behaviour gets even more toxic than it is at the moment, both internationally and domestically, it becomes that much more important for Australia to distance ourselves from what's going on there and from the perception in the region that John has so well described, that we are just, echoes of the master abroad. And it's in that context that, the AUKUS submarine thing worries me particularly. The loss of sovereign agency that's associated with that and the absolute necessity to escape from the perception that we are just there to do the Americans' bidding. Apart from the obvious issues of deliverability, apart from the cost-benefit issue, the thing that worries me most about AUKUS 1, the submarines, is the reality that it will involve the acceptance of that extremely sophisticated technology, a perception on the American side that those boats are there for us to use in the American interest if there's a click of a presidential finger demanding that they be used. And I want to make this point because I thought the sovereignty issue was underemphasised in the previous discussion of AUKUS. And I make the point because I've had some experience of dealing with the Americans in a kinetic situation. I'm talking in particular about the first Gulf War, the good Gulf War, not the lunatic enterprise in 2003, but the one where we jumped to the Security Council decision to support a response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Australia made a couple of boats available, it'll be remembered, some other personnel. We joined the international coalition in response. On getting into station, those boats were immediately ordered, as I remember, I was Foreign Minister at the time, into a particularly vulnerable, exposed location. I called Baker, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, with whom I had quite a good relationship, and said, Jim, you know how much we're on board with this whole enterprise, but we really, this could end in tears for us very, very quickly. We really would have appreciated just a teensy bit of consultation before putting out resources in this particularly exposed location. And what he said to me, as I vividly remember it, and if you'll, I'll modify the language. Listen, buddy, we're running this effing war, not you. Listen, buddy, we're running this effing war, not you. And that concentrates the mind wonderfully in this kind of context. If this is what we're getting into with the AUKUS situation, this is what we have to escape getting into at all costs in terms of regional perception, in terms of global perception, because it's just not going to do us any good at all. As I've often said, you know, whither thou goest, there we goest might be good theology, but it's pretty lousy foreign policy for any country that aspires to any kind of independence.
Can I just make one quick point here? The Trump problem is a problem for everybody. It's not just for Australia. It's not even for democracies. It's a problem for the autocrats as well, right? So when you ask the question of what do we do about it, well, my response would be, well, what is the Australian national interest at stake in any particular policy decision made by Trump? And then we look at what that problem or challenge is, and then we actually pull together a national response to. And now, if you look at how other countries have responded, whether the Canadian, everybody's got a different situation with the United States. So you have to tailor to your national, not only your national interest, but your national capabilities. Now, when it comes to capabilities, we don't have a lot of leverage on the United States, but we do have some, okay? So there are a lot of things we could do. I won't go into all of them now, but we could do a lot of things to make life difficult for the United States or withdraw support from them, things that they need. So it's not a one-way street here. However, we have to be conscious of the fact that we are dealing, we talked about 500-pound pandas or 500-kilogram pandas this morning, you know, well, so the US is even bigger. Just forget it's a third, the economy is third bigger than China's, right? So, all right, so the key point I'm trying to make is that you have to look at very specifically at what is the policy that Trump is taking that's going to affect Australia, and then craft a response that's appropriate for our weight in geopolitical affairs, our alliance relationship with the United States, and our countervailing power, whatever that is. I don't just mean, I mean across the board. Economic, you know, our strategic power. The US wants to have troops in Australia, okay? Not for our benefit, for their benefit. So what would be the prospect of us denying that? And I'm not suggesting we do that, but we do have some leverage.
Very good. Now, thank you. George Brandis, please. Yeah.
I want the panel to expand a little more on what adjustments in the regional strategic architecture might look like. I think we've had somewhat different views. And just as the European democracies and Canada are thinking about a NATO effectively without the United States, is there a case for those Indo-Pacific democracies, which have hitherto, Australia, Japan, South Korea, had bilateral treaties with the United States, New Zealand of course, expanding or creating a new set of arrangements mutually among themselves, including other players, like, for instance, Singapore, including India, including perhaps other states as well, but of democracies traditionally aligned with what we more broadly have called the West? Or is that too narrow a view? Alternatively, is it too expansive a view to think that there could be such an arrangement, and with Canada, absent the United States, as the nation with interests in both oceans, such an arrangement linking with European democracies that remain NATO powers but without the United States?
Who would like? Do you want to have a go at that? Or?
Yeah, sure. At least I'll start it off. Look, thank you very much. I think it's a very good question, George. It's interesting that you're now seeing in some of the academic literature, academics mooting whether we could be seeing the emergence of two Wests, namely the United States and those countries that can still be persuaded to side with it, and the rest, which is the former NATO, Canada, Australia, possibly Japan. Look, I think it would be, in practice, quite difficult to draw these countries that you speak of in the region into any sort of formal relationship. You might get a stronger bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan, and you might see Korea, South Korea somehow being drawn into that. But I'd be surprised to see any sort of formal structure emerging. In relation to, and equally, I think it would take quite a long time to get NATO without the United States into some sort of relationship with the East Asian democracies. Not impossible. There's been talk, for example, at one stage of having a NATO office in Tokyo, which was moving a little tiny bit in that direction. But I think it would take a long time. People would be very wary of the reaction of the United States, even the United States under Trump, which has alienated so many countries. I think it's perhaps worth also underlining that India would almost certainly take a different position. India takes pride in being what it's called multi-aligned. In other words, having a different set of relationships and maybe being with one country on one set of issues, but being with another country on another set of issues. Its policy on Ukraine was an example of that. So I think it would be difficult to see India going much further than the existing structure of the Quad.
Gareth, brief, because I'd like to get some more for the floor. But
look, I think the whole idea of concerts of democracy is a bust. It was tried with Bryden with these democracy summits. It ran into definitional issues about who was going to be invited. There's illiberal democracies all over the place. And moreover, in a regional context, you don't just want the support of fellow democracies, pure or otherwise. You do want the support of serious countries like Vietnam. And, you know, you're not going to get that if you start labelling your security architecture or your aspirations for better architecture in democratic terms. I think we've just got to think in terms of not only the economic architecture that Shiro has been describing, which has serious positive security implications, but also giving real substance to the East Asian Summit, the EAS, the other ASEAN so-called focused regional organisations that do have the potential to create a dialogue environment in which Australia has worked very, very hard in the past to generate support for. I do also think there's some utility in these minilateral arrangements, including the Quad, which is, you know, quasi-democracies, I suppose, not because it's got any prospect of ever becoming a serious military alliance, because the Indians are never going to go that far. But it does nonetheless concentrate the minds of the Chinese, I think, in the reality of an aggregation of pretty significant countries with some obvious capacity to respond to excessive overreach in the region. And more of the same involving a wider variety of countries would be quite a useful addition to the architectural aspirations that you talk about, George.
Thank you. Gareth, Admiral Moffat, Athol Moffat.
Thanks, Malcolm. Rowan Moffat, former naval person.
Sorry. It's a distinguished judge in New South Wales who's called Athol. I always get this wrong. Sorry, beg your pardon.
Not at all. I was struck by a comment that Susanna made, which prompted me to think, and this will lead to a question for the panel. It was, I think I was right in hearing, it was unthinkable some years ago that we would do an amphibious exercise with Indonesia. So in those benign years, while I was still at sea keeping the peace, we did live firing exercises at sea with Indonesia occasionally. We did multilateral and bilateral exercises up to and including live firing exercises with Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and including Japan. Long before those things were common practice, we have exercised at sea in a multitude of ways. We have exercised at sea with the PLA Navy. When I was the fleet commander, we did the first exercise activity at sea in their ships with them. We visited Vladivostok. I visited various places. They visited us, not the Russians, but the PLA Navy visited Sydney with a training squadron in, I think it was about 2000 or 2001 or thereabouts. Not as a part of a larger fleet visit, but as a singular visit of a training squadron into Sydney Harbour, where I escorted the supervising admiral. So these things might, if they're really unthinkable today, that we would do an amphibious exercise with Indonesia, why, when we have done so many things in the past? And what does the panel think might be the impediments from a sort of foreign policy and active engagement in the region perspective, noting also that not only have we done these things within relatively short memory, living memory, but we have also routinely had all of these nations and more in our staff colleges here in Australia, forming relationships, forming friendships between militaries, which we know, because most nations with militaries tend to do precisely that, because it's quite priceless in forming person-to-person relationships. If we're not doing those things today, and I don't feign knowledge of what we're actually doing in the region, if we're not doing them, where we are not doing them, what are the impediments to us doing them?
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, just then I'm going to go to Admiral Barry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you go, Alan.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. Look, we don't need to keep rediscovering the wheel every 20 or 30 years, right? That's your point. I mean, yeah, I know from personal experience we've done a lot of this stuff before. So, okay, we are doing some things well. So a couple of points I make about this whole approach to multilateralism and cooperation with friends, right, and partners is this. Okay, the first thing is that we need to rethink multilateralism fit for the times. We do this consistently over periods historically, right? So China was not, as present as it is now historically for long periods of time, nor was the United States. So it's just a mindset thing that, okay, we need to maybe think about a world where the US is not the preeminent power or is not the dominant ally and therefore underpinning our whole security posture. The US wasn't there once before. We did that okay, right? So, righto. Now on the multilateralism, the point I made in my comments before, I agree with Gareth that, there's a lot of multilateralism is good. We need to use it effectively, and particularly in our region. But we also need to think differently about how we operate with like-minded countries. Like-minded countries are not just democracies, right? Which is Gareth's point. We need to find our friends wherever we can get them. That's a pragmatic approach. And we shouldn't also think about them in sort of geographically bounded arenas, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, etc. anymore. We need to do this globally because we'll find our friends in strange places, maybe even Canada. Okay. No, but the serious point is that if you just take the Indo-Pacific or Asia, whatever you want to call it, so I'll give you one example where we should be doing things differently, and we are starting to do it. Technology cooperation with Japan, okay? And we're even now looking at Japan producing stuff that we use, okay, in a way that we never conceived before. I'm not talking about cars here, I'm talking about things with military impact and capabilities. Japan has changed fundamentally. I just was up there recently and I've followed Japan for 40 years. It's mind-boggling to me to see how far the Japanese are moving in terms of dual-use technology and wanting to share with us without necessarily the US, right? So this is what we've got to be playing this game a bit more. We've got to say, yeah, if the US is in, terrific, but if they're not in, we've got other options. What are they? Now, it's horses for courses. So Japan maybe for that, the Philippines for this, Vietnam for that, the Europeans for that. That's how we've got to be thinking about it.
Well said.
Well, thank you. Admiral Barry.
Is that on now? Yes, it is. Thanks, Malcolm. Well, I've had a fascinating day listening to all sorts of issues and wondering to myself, what does this actually mean in terms of taking our country forward in a totally new strategic environment? As far as I'm concerned, every ball is in the air. I don't think we have the answers to any of them at the moment, but what we do need to have is a very deep conversation about what we want to do. So we need to define our future for ourselves and then set about obtaining it. And I'm afraid that sometimes the conversations go back to what I call laziness and complacency when we start to talk about our past efforts. So what seems to be important to me today is for Australia to take on having conversations with like-minded countries, as has been suggested, a focus in Asia, a focus in the Pacific, islands particularly, and a focus potentially into Europe and other places. I think that our diplomacy has been undercooked for a very long time, and we have, I'd take out half the people in the embassy in Washington and redistribute them into places we would really like to get better results. Secondly, networks are just not about diplomacy. Networks have all sorts of shapes to them, and as Rowan just reminded us, we need to go back to those military conventions where we spent a lot of time talking to each other in our staff colleges, finding out what we all thought about particular issues, and building personal relationships. And of course, that underpins the view that our country's leaders and our ministers as leaders and all of us in the military as leaders and businesses as leaders, we have networks all over the globe which we need to exploit to advantage, because we live in an island, we have the terrific advantage of being an island, yet we have a very large country and a population that probably is the size of a moderate city in other parts of the world. Now, that's a terrific challenge to be looking at security requirements, both from an external security threat and an internal security threat as well, because I think we haven't talked about that today at all. So, everything is up for grabs. But I wrote down a question to myself just a few minutes ago. Are we confident that Americans will not permit Trump to assume president for life? And if not, how might the challenges of such an event be contested?
Well, perhaps, I'm very confident that won't happen. He's many things, Donald, but he's not immortal. So all good things and indeed all bad things come to an end. But it is interesting that he is openly speculating about a third term. And as you know, what the US Constitution says is that you cannot be elected president twice. And what is being mooted is not a constitutional change, which would just take too long, be too hard, but rather what I would call the Putin-Medvedev gambit, which is, you remember when Putin was term limited, he got Medvedev to run for president and he was prime minister, and then they switched back. What is being openly canvassed is that Vance would run as president with Trump as vice president, and then Vance would step down as president and become vice president again. Now, of course, this would require Donald Trump to trust J.D. Vance. So there you go. But I mean, but we do, if ever we're reminded of that great Mark Twain line, only fiction has to be credible, it is now. Now, is there any more from the, just looking around the room? Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. Just one thing.
Just say your name, please.
Michael Costello.
Yeah, sorry, Michael. My eyesight is dimming with age, you see.
Thank
you.
Just to reassure you, the same constitutional provision that prevents him being elected as president also prevents him being elected vice president.
Is that true?
There's
Okay.
a separate provision that says if you're not eligible to be president, you're not eligible to be vice president.
Well, that is a great reassurance. Thank you.
I guess, I mean, it's been a fascinating debate and discussion. I have 2 points that are so obvious, do they really need to be stated? But underlying all this is 2 things. Are we prepared to spend the money? I hear a lot of talk about doing more. We spend about 2%, a bit over 2%, and people are already begrudging that. People are talking about 4 or 5%, and that's probably what we need to do. But does anyone really believe that we're going to be able to sell that the way things have been going?
Michael, I suspect the answer is no, but keep going. Yeah.
If it's going to happen, it's going to happen over a sustained period, and it's going to need major leadership, political leadership, and leadership from the leaders of the community generally. But as short of that, we have to envisage a future where we're not prepared to do what everybody here knows we've got to do, which is to spend enough money to at least cope with the defence requirements that we now face. How we do that is a different question.
Thank you. Let's just get a couple more before we move to James Curran, perhaps Richard Dennis, and so please, so I'll go Richard and then gentleman here. Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks for today, and thanks, everyone. I'll follow up on Mike's point just then. It seems, as an economist, that most of the debate about defence and national security doesn't really engage with economics at all. The underlying premise of economics is everything you do has an opportunity cost. That's it. The rest is kind of details. So if we're going to have a bigger defence force, we need to have a smaller something else. Like, that's it. We're just haggling about, if we want to have a bigger defence force, it sounds like everyone here does, what we need to do is have a democratic conversation about what we're going to have a smaller of. Now, we can have a smaller health budget, we can have a smaller welfare budget, or we could collect more tax. But I just don't, I'm personally not going to take seriously any debate about national security and defence spending which won't say the quiet bit out loud. So I guess my question to the panellists or to anyone else is, to those people that want 3, 4 or 5% of GDP spent on defence, do you support higher taxes, or are you going to try selling less health and less welfare? If you're not willing to grapple with that, then frankly I think the big defence stuff is a bit meaningless.
Thank you, and we'll just...
Tony Milner from ANU. Discussions begin to be more and more interesting in responding, I think, to Heather Smith's suggestion this morning that an old order is really being shattered. And some people, I suppose, are hoping that we keep the framework of the United States alliance, but others are beginning to think beyond that. I mean, how do we talk about doing more in Asia, more engagement with the region? The last time people thought really seriously, I suspect, is the late 1940s, before the US alliance, those few creative years between the fall of Singapore and when we had the security of the US alliance. And both sides of politics thought really creatively, and I suspect we have to think very creatively now. I mean, what's the roadmap if we want to do more with our region? What's the roadmap or the framework if it's not going to be the US alliance? I mean, how will we move more deeply into the region? I mean, Shiro Armstrong, I thought your comments about economics and how we make use of these ASEAN institutions. I mean, ASEAN's got plenty of critics, but we've invested a great deal in ASEAN, and hearing Mike Costello and Gareth Evans and others talking about that, and your own, Malcolm, chairing of that first Australia-ASEAN summit, we have put a lot into ASEAN, but it's not so much ASEAN for its own sake, but it does provide us with an architecture for an engagement in the wider region. In an ASEAN architecture, there's no downsides to that. We can work with Japan in that without provoking China. It provides us with an opportunity for working more closely with, positively perhaps, with China as well as South Korea and India. So the question asked, how might we help ASEAN, but how might ASEAN help us, at least with providing those institutions that we can put more effort into and use as a way of building our relations right across the region. I'm interested in a response to that, perhaps first from Shiro, who focused on the economics, but can we go much more broadly?
Shiro, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a big question. I mean, I think just stepping back and reflecting, the question's been raised a couple of times about China and what's our strategy on China, how we're going to engage China. I think the ASEAN processes help us because they don't want to pick sides. They've got all the principles of equal treatment, openness, resolving disputes peacefully. And I think that it's useful to remember that we're going to have to think about engaging our region on these positive-sum economic issues. A lot of the stuff we've been talking about today is zero-sum. And one side, and this is how the United States sees the rest of the world now, someone else has to lose for it to win, basically. And I don't think that's an anathema to Australia and its engagement with the region. So, dividing the world or the region into democracies and autocracies, that's definitely not going to do it. And finding a way to engage the Chinese through these regional institutions where even the Japanese are comfortable engaging China is a way to avoid backing the Chinese into a corner where they become like Russia, but just 1,000 times bigger.
Okay, well, thank you. Look, thank you, panellists. Thank you, everyone assembled. Is it crew or I can't getting team? Everyone, thank you all. Now, James Curran, distinguished historian, is going to sum the day up and address us before you are all cordially invited to repair to the National Press Club's bar upstairs, which I'm told is open and waiting to lubricate you. Yeah, well, that's right. No, we can stay here. You can stay here if you like. Yeah. I thought yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Malcolm. Look, I think the sense of urgency and rapid change that has pervaded the discussion today has not obscured the fact that, as we know, this issue of the abrupt change in the relationship with the United States has been coming since at least Trump's first term, and really from the disaster of Iraq and the 2008 global financial crisis. Yet for many in Australia, the tendency is to deny it and hold fast to the ANZUS security blanket. That, in public at least, is the attitude of both major political parties, and that's why today's discussion has been so valuable. It's a burr under the saddle, at least, to hopefully start some measured thinking about what we do if we confront, as is likely, not 2 or 4 years of Trump, but a longer-term reordering of Washington's foreign and defence policies and a drastically changed attitude towards allies. Does that term ally still exist meaningfully anymore, I ask? In the Pacific and East Asia, we are yet to be advised of what the Trump policy really is, but can we trust the forthcoming advice? An illustration of how much long-term notice the US has really given us is to recall the climate 9 years ago on the cusp of Trump's first term. I wasn't the only one to recognise, as I did in a short book for Lowy, that we had a history of fighting with America in battles against common adversaries, but when our interests and outlooks had diverged, that we fought with America. We had disagreements with it. Now, in that essay, I noted that since the 1950s, the very term ANZUS has evolved from a simple treaty obligation to become a template for the relationship as a whole, but that it is a common currency freighted with unfulfilled expectations on both sides. I also quoted Peter Edwards, another historian, a distinguished historian, his 2005 judgment that the alliance had evolved into a political institution in its own right, he said, comparable with a political party or indeed the monarchy. I proposed then that we ditch loud proclamations of sentimental loyalty, that instead Canberra would need to think about the virtues of a quiet alliance, an alliance that retains its significant deterrent value, but one that equally doesn't alone define Australia's relations with the world. I said then that we couldn't assume that future generations of Australians would have the same attitude towards the alliance, particularly given the changing demographics of the country, and that we would have to disabuse senior US policymakers of the view that Australia's support is automatic. Now, I think we can draw the implication that that didn't necessarily happen at all times. The critical question, I think, is also whether we are facing now with Trump 2.0, is it an aberration or is it a seismic 8 on the Richter scale of international relations? I think part of the problem, and one of the prime reasons for today and why I think it's been so valuable, is that normally governments try to fit new events such as the Trump shock within their received general assumptions about the international system. And most of these kinds of adjustments are usually patchwork jobs. They don't require people to rethink their fundamental picture of the world. But there are, as we know, certain events which so disturb the existing system that nations are compelled to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, to try and make sense of the future. In the 20th century, World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of fascism, post-World War II Soviet-American confrontation, and the Asian and African rebellion against Western imperialism were just such groundbreaking events, as of course was the end of the Cold War, as of course was 9/11. Now, it's too soon to put Trump into that category, but the evidence so far, and I think there's been, well, maybe not a consensus, but there's been many people today that I think have basically indicated that the evidence is pointing in that direction quite heavily. So the idea of simply gritting the teeth and riding this out might be a useful public strategy while policymakers work out what to do. I suppose, what else are they going to say? But perhaps some different thinking is required, and that's obviously been the purpose of today, and I think that's what we've seen on each of the panels and in the really excellent discussion that's followed them. I think the problem is particularly difficult for some in Australia. I mean, you know, the mind boggles when an event of this kind can be seen as disruption. Or some other joker said that it was populated by the anti-US crowd. Now, this is just so crude and unsophisticated. I mean, I would expect that from my first-year students, but not from serious commentary. I mean, I find that just bizarre, but it's also dangerous because it starts to play into the loyalty card. And we've seen quite enough of that, I think, in recent years in discussing the question of China. And I, you know, just point out that this country had a debate of that kind, the most vicious ever debate in Australian political history over conscription in 1916 and 17. And as a result of the loyalty card being played in that, Australia went into the Second World War virtually unprepared. So I just think there needs to be a bit of care with the language at times. Now, Australia, for its part, has never really had to confront squarely the consequences of the shocks to American belief and purpose. We didn't feel directly strategic failure in Vietnam, or this century in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't see fit to undertake, after those engagements, a fundamental rethink of the assumptions that guide our defence and foreign policy. What we do very well, what we've always done well, is to imagine the old trauma of national survival reproducing itself endlessly, and so adopting policies to meet this historically conditioned contingency. Hence, in recent years, the way in which fealty to the alliance and fear of an Asian power have again fused in a very powerful way. And so naturally enough, we don't tend to handle end of empire moments very well. When Britain first announced its EEC intentions in the early 60s, and then its military withdrawal from Southeast Asia later in the decade, the response from the politicians then was, this is unthinkable, it's unimaginable. There were appeals to Britain to stay, laments. Arguably, it took another decade at least for the country to really sink into the political culture that we would have to face up to a world without Britain. Now, the contemporary equivalent of that is, I think, the studied refusal by ministers in the current government to actually even talk about how weary America is, the weary titan. Also, how crucial topics, we've just heard in this last panel, about the nation's future are sort of brushed under the carpet. I mean, for mine, I think what is far more important than AUKUS, far more important than whatever percentage of GDP we spend on defence, is that we are at the moment standing on the precipice of a fully fledged trade war, and that would be disastrous for this country. So I think Shiro was on the money there. But getting back to the heart of the issue, if we're dealing with this transactionalism as we are, then let's call a spade and set out the state of play. And I stress that this list is not exhaustive. But let's consider what Australia has done for the United States. We've integrated our armed force with the much more powerful US forces to the point where not much useful independent action by Australia can be taken. We are the loyal auxiliary of US forces, ready to be taken in small contingents wherever the US military goes, offering a fig leaf or a UN vote where necessary. The implication, and probably the reality, is that if conflict between China and the US arose, presumably over Taiwan, we would be there, with little room to exercise sovereignty or an independent decision on whether we should be involved. The intimacy of our armed forces is to assist the US military intimidation of China. And therefore, we have earned hostility in our biggest export market, which will be long-lasting, even if the Taiwan issue is settled peacefully. We've assisted the US in reassuring Japan, the Philippines and Singapore, at least, that the US wields effective military power in their neighbourhoods. In other words, we've contributed to the US pursuit of its continuing primacy in East Asia. We've helped preserve US influence in the South Pacific despite rising sea levels and the Trump administration's contempt for climate change. We've maintained our unwavering support for the US despite the destruction by recent administrations, and certainly this one, of the WTO and the International Trade Rules-Based Order. In Pine Gap, we offer a site once essential for US homeland defence from nuclear missile attacks, and despite this, making Australia a nuclear target. Homeland defence tasks can now be diverted elsewhere, but Alice Springs remains a nuclear target and an essential intelligence gathering facility for warfighting for US forces. Elsewhere, of course, we know what's happening at HMS Sterling, the base that's being built there, US Marines in Darwin, nuclear bombers, B-52 bombers at Tyndall, and we've seen the cash registers ring in Washington with Mr. Miles giving the first of the payments to the US submarine industrial base. Now, what's the US done for us, to look at it from the other side? It's provided Australia, since 1942, the psychological defences and reassurance over our fear of attack. A reassurance that has been, I think, quite critical in developing an isolated white nation, as it was then, in the early post-war period, and probably still critical to many, if not most, Australians. This apparent reassurance has also, I think, been very important in establishing the secure investment climate for Australia that brought US and British and later Japanese and EU capital to Australia. That is essential foreign investment for Australian development. Washington also does provide the technical and weapons technology to arm Australia. Without US weapons, intelligence, training, education, the question must be asked, could Australia operate its armed forces? Probably not. US naval power has also offered an implicit security to our sea lanes and trade across the Pacific and to Europe and Middle East markets. Once again, an aspect of investment protection. The US has also built a cultural affinity with Australia, as with many other countries, that has included Australia in its intellectual and cultural world. So the realistic conclusion is that unless Trump disowns the fact of and the trust in ANZUS, as many have said today, it'll have to be the US that walks away, not Australia. But if he does that, as with NATO, then any abrupt breach with the United States will be very damaging to Australia. I mean, that is to say that even if an independent defence and foreign policy was thrust upon Australia, there would be a lot of thinking to be done about the consequences for foreign investment, the development of Australian industry and technology, and it most likely would be interpreted in Australia and indeed abroad that the country was home alone and vulnerable. So to handle that issue at home and abroad, we'd have to develop a vastly different societal approach, at least become mildly paranoid, ready for existential defence and militarised to a significant extent. As many have said today, how do we pay for it? That's quite a different society and certainly the end of our current relaxed style of government. So the idea that we need to grit our teeth, at least for 4 years, and be an even more compliant auxiliary is obviously designed with one objective in mind, and that's the old insurance premium payment policy. That's to improve the chance that the US would help us in a crunch. But that doesn't save us any money if we live up to the 5% defence spending target, which is currently being floated. Okay, finally, an anecdote very quickly. The former Australian ambassador to Washington, later Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Sir Keith Waller, once recalled that in the car on a drive to the White House in 1964 for a meeting with President Lyndon Johnson, Prime Minister Robert Menzies turned to him and said, "I don't know, Waller, why is it that I should be so much more nervous when I see the President of the United States than when I see the Queen?" Now that said much about Menzies' residual comfort in the British world and the nagging suspicion, which I would argue Menzies never quite relinquished, that the US simply didn't have the fundamental stuff of global leadership. Menzies, recall, had in 1951 dismissed Percy Spender's efforts to achieve ANZUS as some kind of diplomatic will-o'-the-wisp. Even if realised, he said he thought that a Pacific Pact would be, quote, a superstructure erected on a foundation of jelly. Now, I think there are a lot of sweaty palms around at the moment, not just in, the Australian cabinet room, but too many sweaty palms instead of being seriously thoughtful about what Trump means and what he might mean. Today's leaders are going to need a lot more guile to negotiate Trump. It's not the time for poking America in the eye or kicking it in the shins, because what will that achieve? But it's also most certainly not the time to be getting on one's knees to the mad king in Washington either. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you all very much. I hope this has been a good day. I think these are vitally important issues, and this is a conversation that more Australians need to have, and I hope today will contribute to them doing so. Thank you.